And, but we will move to the issue of migration. Let me see. Okay. Because I wanted, now we will discuss about some of definitions of migration, because I think it's very important to use the terms in a precise way, especially because we are flooded with the media, news, propaganda, interpretation that just mix the terms, and not knowing the terms or not using the terms in a correct way hinders the ability to then, actually to take action in the appropriate way, but also to understand what the phenomenon is, what numbers we are talking about. And in my view, to have a very clear understanding of the terminology, the typology of migration involved, and the data is a key starting point. Not only for you, but also, in your work for the students to start, understanding and looking at the issue of migration, based on good information, on sound data, and a good understanding of the phenomenon. Because unfortunately, when some issues is taken by the news, also then it gets interpreted also in a very imprecise and sometimes misleading way. So I think it's very important to also teach, to go back to data, to use data to build some arguments, and to use this data and information as something that can support what you do. So I just wanted to, often we use this term migrant or refugees. And in Italy, now a bit less, but until a couple of years ago at least, we used to use this term clandestine all the time. Now I think it's, I don't know, what do you think? It's a bit less, no? Still, but not as such. I think now there is a bit more of an awareness of use terminology of the term. But this term, clandestine or something, it's already negative. I mean, it's not a positive term, so you're already, by using a negative term like clandestine, you're already kind of giving a negative picture, and to overcome this negative picture, you need double work than to start from a neutral term. So I think it's very important to start from that. So I didn't go into the details of clandestine. I'm sure in all of your countries and languages there are other terms that were used with the same. There's another one, which is, for example, the UN is making a lot of focus on. There's another term that this is still widely used in Italy: illegal migrants. Yes. There is no such thing as illegal migrants. It's either regular or irregular. Even that I don't really like, because irregular is not the migrant which is irregular. It's irregular the migration route. The process is not the migrant which is irregular as such, as a person. How can you be regular or irregular? I don't find very important to use the terminology, and as we talk, please make sure that you try to identify the term in your own language that fits. So still, I think we have a lot of confusion about the terms refugee and migrants. They're often used interchangeably, and a lot of confusion is made. When we see this movement of millions of people that are on the move, either if they are fleeing conflicts or just moving because they are searching for better opportunities, they are either called refugees or migrants. And often there is no attention to why these terms are used. Actually, the two terms, especially the term refugee, has a very clear definition we can say in international law. And so to be a refugee, you have to have some specific characteristics with respect to your context. So refugees are persons who are actually outside their countries of origin because of specific reasons. These reasons are feared persecution, conflict, generalized violence. So they're actually going away from the country because of the specific, issues that they can, they fear persecution, they are at risk of suffering violence, and therefore they are moving, and they can seek international protection. So for the accepted, as I was saying, in terms of the migrant, the international migrants, there is no accepted definition internationally, but there is no like a formal definition, but as an accepted definition is someone who changes the country of residence irrespective of the reason of migration or the legal status. So a migrant can include regular or irregular migrant. So a migrant is someone who's changing the country of residence, and there is no the reason that has motivated this change of residence, the fact that these people have moved out of their country, is not something that has an impact on the definition of migrant. So you can have migration that is perfectly voluntary or not, but still, this is a migration. So in terms of migration, you have more distinction between short-term migration, permanent migration, circular migration, which is someone who migrates for a certain number of time and then goes back. So they are all, different type of definitions. So migration is defined as, here as a reference, we look the definition of the International Organization for Migration, terminology of key terms. So migration is defined as the movement of a person or group of persons. Here they talk about also internal migration, either across an international border or within a state. It's a population movement encompassing any kind of movement of people, whatever is land, composition, and causes. So here, irrespective of the reason of migration, you see. It includes migration of refugees, displaced persons, economic migrants, and persons moving from other purposes, including family reunification. So here, actually, IOM includes refugees as a kind of a subset of migrants, because they have, and you can see why. If you consider migrants as someone who has changed their country of residence, or the internally displaced who are in the same countries but they moved from one area of the country to another area of the same country, they are, even though the causes could be fleeing conflicts or natural disaster or any other conflicts that actually force them to move, they are still in the broader category of migrants. So I want to just make this clear. There is the migration has so refugees can be considered a subset of migrants. But what really differentiates the concept of refugee is the reason of why they moved. So migrant. So again, here the IOM key terminology talks about both internal and international migration. While in general terms, when you read reports or the news, when you talk about migrant, it is referred to international migrants. I think depending on the context of what you are working on, you will have very clear in mind whether it is referring to internal national migrants or international migrants. So migrant is any person who is moving or has moved across an international border or within a state away from his or her habitual place of residence, regardless of the legal status, whether the movement is voluntary or involuntary, what the causes for the movement are, or what the length of the stay is. Okay, now we will go into the definition of internally displaced person and refugees. So internally displaced person would be someone who has left because of a problem, but they remained within the same country. No? So internally displaced persons are persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or place of habitual residence, in particularly as a result or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence. You can think about places that are subject to terrorist attacks like the Boko Haram in Nigeria, violations of human rights or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. So they are still within the same country. While a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of persecutions for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinions. Here there's also even, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. So it means someone who has actually left the country because of fear of persecution. And in addition to that, there is also gender, sexual orientation. There are some of the grounds for which also refugee status can be, considered granted. So a refugee cannot have, the protection for the human rights by their own country. That is why they are fleeing their country, and they are therefore entitled to search for protection in another country. So, but here, so we went to definition, so we know what we mean by different terms. But another point that I really want to make very clear is actually that migration is a continuum, no, between voluntary migration, what is called mixed migration, and forced migration. And for that, unfortunately, I mean, there is not really kind of official definitions, even on mixed migration, that you can say, something that you can use with legal terminology. But there is an understanding of what these terms mean. So voluntary migration, and again here, what is voluntary is open to debate, is the migration that is taking place to seek better opportunities in general. For example, to study abroad, to look for a job, but people move when they already have an employment opportunity waiting for them. Also for family reunification, you can do this voluntary migration. But again, here, I mean, you always, when you consider voluntary migration, which is, in Italy we call this also economic migration or labor migration, no? People that migrate economically. And interestingly, there is often a sort of kind of even prejudice against the economic migrants, because it's someone who has actually the choice to stay in their country, but they, no matter what, they decided to leave and to come to another country where they may or may not find actually this opportunity that they were looking to find. So I'm saying this to say that there's always a need to reflect on what is voluntary. Because voluntary, if you have two big executive jobs waiting for you, one in your country, one in France, then probably it's really a voluntary choice. If you're working but in a marginal farm and you don't have access to healthcare, you cannot pay for the education of your children, yes, you're surviving, but almost just surviving. I mean, is it really voluntary to migrate? Or is really something that is in a way something that, you're in a context of poverty, there is a strong motivation to migrate because you are not really satisfying all of your basic needs. And I would say that for me, a good part of the migrants moving are actually falling in this category, which is what is generally, in the literature defined as the mixed migration, when there are kind of overlapping causes and determinants of migration, where people find themselves, trapped in poverty with the absence of viable economic opportunities, where they don't think they can really, build a future for their children, so they decide to leave. They are not probably in dangers of life and death. At the same time, they make some calculation and, sometimes informed, sometimes less informed, by the risks and the opportunity, and decide to move. In the mixed migration group, there is always often this categorization of those who are actually suffering these conditions of poverty. Maybe there is not a natural disaster as such. There is kind of an event that forced them to flee in a sudden kind of way. But for example, the slow onset of the climate change that makes the certification advance, and year after year the situation is becoming worse, this is something that can, not make people flee in a moment, but understand that the situation is just continuously deteriorating and therefore provide a justification to move. Then, we go to the other end, which is what is called the forced migration. Forced migration is, often, considered in parallel with the refugee status, and is those who are fleeing actually conflicts, human-made crises. So, what is called involuntary or forced migration. Probably, migrants, they didn't really want to leave their countries, but they just couldn't stay there because there was a war going on. If they stayed, they would be arrested as political opponents. They destroyed their homes. They just had to go. There was a natural disaster that, totally destroyed even the economic opportunities they had. And another point I want to make is that actually this determinants of migration often also change through time, because migration is complex, it's a process, sometimes it lasts years, and therefore, people can start as a voluntary migrant looking for a job, and then as years pass, then find themselves into another situation. So this is just to show that migration, paths are often complex, and you can see, that if you look at these red arrows, you can see that someone can start by leaving their village, go into the first bigger city, into that same rural area, stay there 1 year, a couple of years, they move to the capital of the country. Then again, after a while, find some more funds and resources to live, and then try the international migration. Then also when they return, because migration is also a path of return in many cases, then they can either return directly from their village or the area of origin, or again, return first to the capital city and then retire at the end into their area of origin, even if it was a small rural area. So all of that, it's something that you need to consider. The migration doesn't happen in 2 hours flight, but it's something that sometimes takes years because of the process, of the need to accumulate further funding and resources, or because people get actually trapped in Libya or in other, in other countries where actually they become unable to live. And just to show, this is a story of Demba, which is a fantasy name, but from actually a true story of someone who was in a research thesis for a PhD of a colleague of mine, Eleonora Castagnone, who was tracking this migration path from Senegal up to Europe. So Demba started moving from its small village Matan, Senegal, and went to Dakar to look for a better opportunity of work. So it started as an internal migrant and stayed there. This was so internal migrant. Nothing, specifically dramatic about this change. As many others in his village, he went to Dakar to try and find other opportunities. Then he wanted to start he wanted to try to go to Europe to see whether he could find a better job. So he became an international migrant and crossed over and managed to go to Libya as an international migrant. But then once in Libya, he actually got trapped and in this horrible detention center that are there, and they got trapped there for a number of years. And then, so when actually he went to Europe, he was actually fleeing immediate danger because he was tortured, arrested, and then finally he managed to reach to Europe. But then once in Europe, it was actually as a refugee. So, the path has changed through time. And even, you know, in the intention of Demba, this was not the story he had imagined. And also in, you know, the fact when he actually left his country, he was not fleeing immediate danger there, but he found immediate, you know, he found dangers and fear for his life along the way. So I think it's important to consider that also, you know, the way, the migration, the type of migration status that people have once they reach Europe is also the result of a process of migration that sometimes lasts for a very long time, and is not the one that was chosen by the migrants in the first place. So the latest data says actually the number of internal migrants, this is an estimation, is 763 million internal migrants. And the latest data about international migrants of a couple of years ago talks about 244 million international migrants. So as you can see already, you know, there is 2/3 internal migrants as opposed to you know, of the number of international migrants. So the number of internal migrants is much bigger. As you say, it's a big phenomenon, especially in some of the southern countries, even in Africa or in Asia. It has been estimated there has been an increase of 40% on the numbers of international migrants since 2000. 150 are considered migrant workers, which means those who move for labor migration. So this, I will leave that you have, here we talk about international migrants, so there are 100 million that are not labor migrants. And 1/3 of all international migrants for developing countries are actually quite young, because they are in the age group of between 15 and 34 years of age. And I think this is very important to notice, because it's actually, you know, the part of the population that is in a better position to contribute to also economic development, work, creation of income, innovation, both in the areas of origin and in the areas of destination. And, you know, this big part of probably, you know, the most innovative, ambitious part of the youth, they actually live in the countries and come into the countries of destination. So, and almost half of international migrants are women. This is also important, because often when we think about migrants, or at least, you know, in the images that we see, often we see men more than women. And a large share of international migrants originates from rural areas. And you have here 65 million that are forcibly displaced, which would be those that also concern refugees. I want to show this graph that maybe you have already seen in one of the webinars, if you attended it, maybe, no? Because I know that some data on migration was shown. This is, I will, try and come with the interpretation, which is not so easy, because there are the names are small. So this is Europe, this is Asia, Africa, and North America. I think what I want to really show you is that the majority of migration flows does not come to Europe. The majority of the migration flows actually stay within the continent. So there is a huge, you know, in Europe there's a huge movement from, for example, Europe to Europe. Asia, the big part of movement from Asia actually goes to other Asian countries, and the same in Africa. There is a big movement from African countries to African countries. And I think this is something that we always need to keep in mind, and even look, I can provide you, you know, specific in the presentation, when I send you the presentation, some tables in which you have actually specific data of estimation. What is the flow of migrants from Africa to Africa, from Africa to Europe, because I think this is something that kind of, you know, counterbalances some of the headlines that we see in the news. Yes?
It's also a good argument to say to people that say, oh, they are coming here. It's a very good argument to say that the statistics say that.
No, the statistics and yes. This is, to give just an example, a graph of the intra-regional migration in sub-Saharan Africa. And here, this talks about intra-regional. Intra-regional, which means doesn't shows the movement to Europe. There are also movement to Europe, they are not shown here. Here is only intra-regional. But to see, see how active here. From this country, there's a lot of people that actually migrate to South Africa. The movement in West Africa is huge, and there's also a lot of circular migration. West Africa is an area also of a bit like Europe, of free movement of people. They have a common currency, same coin. The borders are open, free movement of people and goods. It's a huge migration happening there. And also the same in the North Africa here, we don't see it, but from North Africa and the Middle East, very huge. So we talk about this number of international migration. The majority, the millions of numbers, they come from these movements. This is international migration. From Togo to Ghana is international migration. But when, in the news we hear about international migration, we think there are all people coming to Europe, international migration. Even in Asia, there are huge movements. In Southeast Asia, for example, we know about also maybe we hear more about the movement in Latin America going towards the US, but also between Latin American countries. So which is the country where the majority of people find asylum in 2017? Can you read? Turkey. Turkey is the #1 country worldwide offering asylum to refugees. What's the second country worldwide? Bangladesh. Bangladesh is the second one.
Because of Myanmar, though.
Because of Myanmar, yes, because of, you say, it's Myanmar, from Myanmar. But if you consider about, refugees, Bangladesh, there's a country that already has its own issue, is the country that, and also Turkey, is not, the country that is in the best economic moment at the moment. The third country for a refugee is Sudan. You consider Sudan, country, in one of the worst in terms of the Human Development Index, poverty, where, there's a lot of conflicts also, going on, is an area that has a lot of issue. Is the third country in terms of providing asylum to refugees, and then Uganda. So you have Uganda, then you have Congo, DRC, Ethiopia. So I think for me this is really something that when people complain about being flooded with refugees. This is something that is very important. Another country that is not quoted here, but for me is also very important, if you consider, is Lebanon. Lebanon is not considered here because in terms of refugees that are in Lebanon, it must be around maybe 2 million. So it's not 60 million, it's not huge numbers. No, sorry, 68. This is in thousand, so it's 2 million, and but the size of Lebanon is about what, 40 million maybe people, 55 million. No, sorry, 40 million is 3.5 million. Yes, they won't say 40. So basically, you have more than 1/3 of the population of Lebanon is refugee. So even though it's not a country that has a huge number of refugees, in terms of the strain on the host communities, because you have 1 in 3 is a refugees, then of course especially if there is a situation in which these refugees are not able to actually contribute economically, they really become a cost and an issue for society, especially also of creating tension between host communities and the refugee community.